She inherited a strange house in the woods from her grandmother and thought it was a mistake. In winter, it became clear why it was built and what was hidden inside. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The letter arrived on an ordinary weekday morning, folded once too many times, the paper soft at the edges, as if it had already been passed from hand to hand before reaching her. She opened it standing in the narrow kitchen of the rented apartment, the kettle cooling behind her, her son at the table working through his homework with the stubborn concentration of a child who sensed that something in the air was unstable, even if he could not yet name it. The letter was short, impersonal, written in language that did not care whether it was read by someone tired, frightened, or alone. It informed her that she was the sole heir to a parcel of land registered in her grandmother's name, including a residential structure of non-standard classification. It listed coordinates, a district she barely remembered, and a deadline by which the property had to be either claimed or formally declined. She read it twice before sitting down. The chair creaked beneath her weight, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. Her son looked up, searching her face for cues. She smiled out of habit, not because she felt reassured. Her grandmother had been dead for 3 years. There had been no funeral worth naming, no inheritance to argue over, no sentimental division of objects. The woman had lived alone for most of her life, on the edge of places people passed through rather than stayed in. When she was mentioned at all, it was usually with a shrug, followed by a comment about stubbornness, impractical choices, or a quiet refusal to live as everyone else did. As a child, she had found her grandmother unsettling. As an adult, she had learned to stop asking questions. Now the questions returned, unwanted and persistent. By the time evening came, the apartment felt smaller than usual. The walls pressed inward, as if reminding her that they were not hers, that the rent was due again soon, that the job she relied on had already cut her hours once and could do so again without warning. She cooked dinner mechanically, listening to her son talk about school, about a boy who had shoved him in the hallway, about a math problem he almost understood. She nodded in the right places, answered when needed, but her thoughts were already elsewhere, circling around the words sole heir and deadline. After her son went to bed, she searched the district online. The map loaded slowly. The place was farther than she had expected, beyond the last regular bus routes, where roads thinned into lines that looked almost hypothetical. There were comments attached to the area, scattered and unhelpful. Harsh winters, poor soil, limited infrastructure, a place people left when they could. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, the glow of the screen fading from the room. Declining the inheritance would be easy. She could send a form, sign her name, and let the land return to the state, disappear back into paperwork and neglect. Claiming it meant responsibility, uncertainty, and the risk of uprooting her son for something she did not yet understand. The next morning, she filled out the forms. The decision surprised her with how quietly it settled. There was no sense of triumph, no dramatic resolve. It felt less like choosing and more like stepping onto a path that had already been waiting. By the time she mailed the documents, the apartment no longer felt like shelter. It felt temporary in a way that went beyond furniture and leases. 2 weeks later, they were on the road. The car was old but reliable, its trunk packed with more caution than optimism. Clothes, blankets, canned food, notebooks, tools she barely remembered how to use. Her son sat in the back seat, his forehead pressed to the window, counting abandoned buildings as they passed. The city dissolved behind them without ceremony, replaced by long stretches of land where nothing announced itself except the wind. As the road narrowed, the sense of distance changed. It was no longer measured in miles, but in the absence of signs, of familiar sounds, of anything that suggested urgency. Her phone lost signal somewhere between two unnamed intersections and did not regain it. She turned it off to save the battery, feeling an irrational relief as the screen went dark. They arrived in the late afternoon. The land revealed itself slowly, as if reluctant to be seen all at once. There were no fences to mark its boundaries, only subtle shifts in the ground, a change in the way the grass grew, a line of stones half buried in earth. The wind moved freely, unhindered by trees. Forest lay far off, sparse and thin, the kind that offered little comfort in winter. And then there was the house. It did not announce itself as a house. It rose from the land in a low, rounded shape, its surface uneven, textured, the color of dried earth and old straw. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for a natural formation, a mound left behind by some forgotten process. There were no sharp edges, no corners to catch the eye. It was quiet in a way that unsettled her, as if it had learned how to remain unnoticed. Her son stepped out of the car first. He stood still, hands in his pockets, studying the structure with an expression that balanced curiosity and doubt. She watched him carefully, aware that his reaction mattered more than her own. Children notice things adults dismissed. "It looks like a hill," he said finally. She nodded. Up close, the door was visible, set low into the curve of the wall, framed with weathered wood. The handle was cold beneath her hand when she tried it, heavier than she expected. The door opened without protest. Inside, the air was different. Not warm, not cold, but steady. The smell was neutral, faintly earthy, without the sharpness of damp or mold she had braced herself for. Light entered through narrow openings, set deep into the walls, angled in a way that softened it. The space was small, undeniably so, but it did not feel cramped. The ceiling curved overhead, drawing the eye upward and around, erasing any sense of conventional geometry. Her son took a few steps in, then stopped. He ran his fingers along the wall, testing its texture. It was smooth, warmer than stone, cooler than wood. "It's quiet," he said. She realized then that he was right. The wind outside had been strong enough to rock the car slightly, but inside the sound barely reached them. It was not silence exactly, but a muted presence, as if the house absorbed noise rather than reflected it. They explored slowly. There were no rooms in the way she expected, only spaces that flowed into one another, defined by purpose rather than separation. Sleeping areas carved into the thickness of the walls, shelves molded directly from the structure itself, a low table fixed to the floor, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Everything felt intentional, even if its logic was not yet hers. Outside, she found the stone structure her grandmother had mentioned once, long ago, in a sentence she had not understood at the time. It stood a few steps away from the house, solid and exposed, sheltered by a simple overhang. The opening bore the blackened marks of fire, old but not abandoned. She frowned, unease tightening in her chest. Fire belonged inside houses. Everyone knew that. The neighbors came before sunset. They approached openly, without hostility, but without warmth either. Their glances lingered on the house, then on her son. Questions followed, some framed as concern, others barely masking judgment. Was she really planning to stay? Did she know what winters were like here? Had she seen the structure closely? One man laughed outright when he noticed the shape of the building. Another shook his head and muttered something about straw and foolishness. Someone pointed toward the stone structure and asked where the stove was. When she explained, the expressions shifted from amusement to disbelief. "That thing will burn," a woman said flatly, "or rot, or both." She did not argue. She listened, nodded, thanked them for the information. She felt no need to defend what she did not yet understand herself. That night, they slept inside the dome for the first time. The floor was firm beneath the blankets. The air did not change as the temperature outside dropped. Her son fell asleep quickly, exhaustion claiming him without resistance. She lay awake longer, listening, counting the seconds between gusts of wind, waiting for cold to creep in through unseen cracks. It did not. Instead, a strange calm settled over her, cautious and incomplete, but real. The house did not promise comfort. It promised something else, something she could not yet name. Not safety, exactly, not certainty, but endurance. As she finally closed her eyes, she understood that this land, this house, was not an inheritance she could accept or refuse lightly. It was already asking something of her. Morning came without a clear boundary. There was no sudden light flooding the space, no sharp line between night and day. Instead, the interior of the dome slowly changed tone, the dim gray of pre-dawn softening into something warmer, almost golden, though the sun itself remained hidden behind the curvature of the walls. She opened her eyes, unsure at first whether she had slept deeply or merely drifted, suspended in a half-waking state, shaped by unfamiliar silence. Her son was already awake. He sat upright in the sleeping niche carved into the wall, his knees pulled to his chest, watching the thin band of light that crept along the floor. When he noticed her stirring, he smiled, tentative, but genuine. "It didn't get cold," he said, as if stating a fact that still required confirmation. She nodded, pushing herself up. The floor beneath her bare feet was cool, but not unpleasant, carrying a steady temperature that seemed unchanged from the night before. Outside, the wind had not eased. She could hear it now, faint and distant, as though it belonged to another place entirely. They moved carefully at first, learning the space through repetition. The dome did not tolerate haste. Every motion echoed differently, every step felt slightly amplified, not in sound, but in awareness. The curved walls redirected movement, guiding rather than obstructing. It was impossible to walk straight for long without adjusting one's path. The house required attention. She inspected the interior more thoroughly in daylight. What she had taken for simplicity revealed itself as restraint. There was nothing excessive here, but nothing arbitrary either. The sleeping alcoves were deep, their backs insulated by the thickest part of the wall. The shelves followed the curve of the dome, their edges smooth, their surfaces worn in places where hands had reached again and again. There were no sharp corners, nowhere for dust to gather, nowhere for cold air to settle. Her grandmother had not built a shelter in haste. This was the work of patience. The windows, narrow and recessed, were positioned with precision. One caught the morning light, another the late afternoon glow. None faced directly into the prevailing wind. Standing near them, she could feel the difference, how the air remained calm even when the gusts outside grew stronger. The walls did not flex or creak, they absorbed. Her son explored freely now, running his hands over the surfaces, tapping lightly on the walls, testing how sound behaved. He crouched near the floor, pressing his palm against the earth-hardened surface, then frowned in concentration. "It's warm here," he said, pointing not to the wall closest to the door, but to the center of the room. She followed his gesture, but dismissed it at first as imagination. Children noticed patterns where adults imposed logic. Still, she stored the observation somewhere in her mind, alongside other small details that did not yet align. Outside, the stone structure waited. She had avoided it the night before, content to let daylight soften her fear. In the morning, it looked less menacing and more deliberate. The stones were fitted tightly, without mortar in some places, with it in others, as though different sections had been built at different times. The opening was wide enough to accept thick logs, the interior blackened with old soot. Above it, The overhang angled outward, shielding the fire from direct exposure to rain or snow. This was the heart of her discomfort. Fire belonged indoors. Fire was something you watched closely, something you controlled. An external stove felt like an admission of distance, of trust placed in structure rather than vigilance. She gathered kindling and wood from the circular storage area nearby, where logs were stacked carefully under a partial shelter. They were dry, surprisingly so, despite having been exposed to the elements. Air moved freely between them, carrying away moisture. Her grandmother had thought of that too. When she lit the fire, she did it cautiously, ready to extinguish it at the first sign of trouble. The flame caught easily, steady and bright. Heat radiated outward, not aggressively, but with purpose. She waited for smoke to drift toward the dome, for the smell of burning to seep into the house. It did not. Inside, the change was subtle. There was no rush of warmth, no immediate reward. Instead, the walls seemed to hold their breath. Minutes passed, then more. Her son sat at the low table, drawing circles on a scrap of paper, occasionally glancing toward the door. An hour later, she noticed it. The air had shifted. Not warmer in the way a room warmed by a heater became warmer, but deeper, more stable. The chill she had not fully acknowledged receded. The house did not react quickly. It responded. She felt a flicker of something close to trust, quickly suppressed. Trust was dangerous. Trust led to mistakes. The neighbors returned that afternoon, curiosity drawing them back. They stood at a distance at first, watching her tend the fire outside. Questions came, layered with disbelief. Why not bring the stove indoors? Did she understand how risky this was? Had her grandmother really lived like this? She answered what she could, avoided what she could not. She did not argue. She felt no need to persuade. The house was not a statement. It was a condition. After they left, her son asked why people laughed. "They don't know it yet," she said, then paused. "Neither do we." The second night tested her more than the first. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset, faster than she expected. The wind rose, pushing against the dome with persistent force. She listened for signs of weakness, for the whistle of air through cracks, for the dull thud of something giving way. None came. Instead, the sound of the wind softened as it passed over the curved surface, diverted rather than resisted. Inside, the air remained still. She lay awake again, counting breaths, aware of every sensation. The warmth did not fluctuate. It lingered, constant and unhurried. By morning, she was exhausted not from discomfort, but from vigilance. Days passed in this way, each one adding a layer of familiarity without fully dissolving doubt. She learned how the house behaved, what it tolerated, what it ignored. She learned that it punished impatience. Fires built too hot wasted fuel without improving comfort. Fires built too low delayed their effect. There was a rhythm to it, one that required observation rather than force. Her son adapted faster. He stopped asking when the house would feel normal. He began to accept that this was normal, simply different. He learned where to sit when the air felt cooler, where the light was strongest at different times of day. He noticed things she overlooked, patterns she was too distracted to see. One evening, as she was preparing their simple meal outside, stirring a pot suspended over the fire, she realized something unsettling. She was no longer waiting for the house to fail. The fear remained, but it no longer dominated her actions. She had begun to adjust herself instead, aligning her expectations with the structure rather than trying to impose her own. The house did not bend. It instructed. That night, as she lay beside her sleeping son, she thought of her grandmother in a new way. Not as the distant, impractical figure she remembered, but as someone who had learned to live within limits rather than against them. Someone who had chosen this form, this method, because it answered questions no one else was asking. The thought did not comfort her. It unsettled her. Because if the house truly worked as it seemed to, then her grandmother had not been preparing for convenience or solitude. She had been preparing for something else entirely. By the time the first real snow fell, the house had ceased to feel unfamiliar in the way new places usually did. It had not become comfortable, but it had become legible. She began to understand its moods, its patience, the way it responded not to urgency but to consistency. The dome did not reward sudden effort. It answered only to repetition. The snow arrived quietly, a thin white layer that settled into every shallow depression of the land, smoothing its roughness without concealing it. From the inside, the change was visible only through the narrow windows, where light grew softer and the horizon lost definition. The temperature inside the dome shifted almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the season rather than reacting to it. Electricity failed 2 days later. There was no dramatic blackout, no flickering lights or alarms. The single line feeding the distant houses simply went dead, leaving the settlement in a subdued, uneasy stillness. She learned of it not through a notification or a phone call, but through absence. The small radio she had brought remained silent. The charger no longer worked. The routine she had unconsciously relied on dissolved without ceremony. She had expected panic. Instead, what she felt was something closer to pressure. The knowledge that from now on, every decision would carry weight. The house did not care. It continued to hold its temperature, its walls warm beneath her palm, the air steady. The system her grandmother had built had never relied on electricity. That realization should have reassured her. Instead, it sharpened her awareness of everything else that could fail. She turned her attention to the supplies. The storage niches built into the walls held more than she had first assumed. They were not obvious, not labeled, or grouped in a way that suggested abundance. The food was there in modest quantities, arranged with a logic that only revealed itself once she began counting. There were sacks of dried beans and lentils, their fabric thick and carefully stitched. Jars of coarse flour ground from grains she could not immediately identify. Bundles of dried herbs tied with twine, labeled in her grandmother's precise handwriting. Root vegetables stored in a shallow underground pit adjacent to the dome, insulated by layers of earth and straw. Apples dried into leathery slices. Berries reduced to dark, wrinkled shapes that still carried the faint smell of summer. There was salt. Honey. Nothing luxurious. Nothing wasted. She spread everything out one afternoon, laying it on the low table and along the curved shelves, inventorying with the focus of someone who understood that guessing was no longer an option. Her son watched quietly, sensing the seriousness of the task. "How long will it last?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. Honesty mattered now more than reassurance. "If we're careful," she said, "the winter." He nodded, absorbing the implication. Careful was not a vague instruction. It was a requirement. Cooking moved entirely outdoors. The stone stove became the center of their routine, not a convenience, but a constraint. She learned quickly that fuel was as precious as food. Each fire had to serve multiple purposes: heat for the house, heat for cooking, heat stored for later release. She could not afford to burn wood simply to feel warmth in the moment. The meals were simple to the point of austerity. Thick soups made from beans and roots, stretched over several days. Flat breads cooked directly on heated stone surfaces, their edges uneven, their centers dense. Occasionally, apples softened with honey, a treat that felt almost extravagant. There was no frying, no boiling water without purpose. Everything that touched the fire had to justify itself. At first, her son complained, not loudly, not with entitlement, but with the quiet disappointment of a child whose body remembered variety. She listened without scolding. She explained why the meals were the way they were, why portions mattered, why they could not afford to be careless. She did not dramatize it. She trusted him to understand. And he did. He adapted faster than she expected. He learned to eat slowly, to notice flavors, rather than seek fullness. He began to ask questions about quantities, about how much wood a fire consumed, about how long the walls stayed warm after the flames died down. She answered when she could, admitted when she could not. The rhythm of their days settled into something precise. Mornings were for checking the fire site, clearing ash, selecting wood. Afternoons for gathering water, maintaining the storage areas, repairing small things that had begun to loosen under the strain of weather. Evenings for cooking, then retreating inside as darkness fell and the cold pressed closer. Inside the dome, time behaved differently. Without screens or clocks, the passage of hours was marked by light and sensation. The walls warmed gradually after each fire, releasing heat long after the stove had gone dark. She noticed that the floor near the center of the room held warmth longest, even when the outer edges cooled. She remembered her son's earlier observation and stored it away, unresolved. The pressure from outside did not disappear with the snow. If anything, it intensified. One afternoon, 2 men from the local administration arrived, their boots leaving deep impressions in the fresh layer of white. They spoke politely, their voices measured, but their questions carried an edge. They asked about permits, about safety standards, about the suitability of the dwelling for a minor. They did not step inside the dome. They did not need to. Their concerns were already formed. She answered carefully, presenting documents, pointing out that the house predated current regulations, that it had been continuously inhabited. She did not mention the power outage, did not emphasize how little the house relied on external systems. She sensed that competence could be mistaken for defiance. When they left, they did not offer reassurance. They promised follow-up. That night, she slept poorly. The weight of responsibility pressed down harder than the cold ever could. She lay awake listening to her son breathe, acutely aware that her choices affected not only her own comfort, but his safety, his future. Doubt crept in, insidious and persistent. What if she was wrong? What if the house failed when it mattered most? What if her grandmother's calculations no longer applied? The dome offered no answers. It did not change in response to her fear. It remained as it was, steady and indifferent. The first real test came sooner than she expected. A storm rolled in without warning, driven by winds stronger than any they had yet experienced. Snow fell sideways, piling against the outer walls, pressing into every exposed surface. The sound of it was relentless, a constant hiss punctuated by sudden impacts as gusts slammed into the structure. Inside, the temperature began to drop. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough for her to notice. She added wood to the fire, careful not to overdo it. She waited. The response was slower than usual. The walls absorbed the heat, but the cold outside seemed to draw it away more aggressively. Panic flickered at the edges of her thoughts. She fought it down, focusing instead on observation. She moved through the space, placing her hand against the walls, against the floor, mapping warmth and coolness with deliberate attention. The center remained warmer. The edges cooled faster. Her son watched her, quiet but alert. When she paused, he spoke. "The middle stays warm longer," he said, "even when the fire's out." She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a mixture of pride and unease. He was noticing what she had only half acknowledged. The house was teaching him, just as it was teaching her, but in different ways. They made it through the storm without crisis. The temperature dipped, then stabilized. The house did not fail. But the incident left its mark. It stripped away her remaining illusions about control. She understood now that survival here was not guaranteed by effort alone. It depended on understanding systems that did not explain themselves readily. Days later, her son developed a cough. It was mild at first, nothing that would have concerned her under other circumstances. But here, isolated and exposed, it took on greater significance. She monitored him closely, adjusting their routine, ensuring he stayed warm, increasing his portions slightly, despite the calculations screaming caution. She blamed herself relentlessly. Every decision she had made came under scrutiny. Had she misjudged the house? Had she underestimated the cold? Had she trusted too much in a structure she did not fully understand? The dome remained silent. On the third night of his illness, she sat beside him as he slept, her hand resting on the floor near his bed. The warmth there was unmistakable, steady, and deep. She pressed harder, feeling not surface heat, but something stored beneath. Her gaze drifted toward the center of the room, toward the stone slab set into the floor. She had noticed it before, dismissed it as part of the foundation. Now, under the weight of fear and responsibility, it took on a different significance. She did not act on the thought. Not yet. But the seed had been planted. The house was not simply shelter. It was a system. And she was only beginning to understand how little of it she truly knew. The cold did not announce itself with drama. It arrived as a correction, a recalibration of everything she thought she had learned. One morning, the light through the narrow windows looked thinner, stripped of its earlier softness, and the air inside the dome carried a sharper edge. The change was small enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to resist denial. She noticed it first in her hands when she reached for the kettle, then in the way her breath lingered faintly when she stood still. Outside, the land had hardened. Snow no longer yielded underfoot with a whisper, but resisted, crusted and brittle. The wind had found a new voice, lower and more deliberate, sliding along the curve of the dome rather than striking it head-on. The house answered by remaining still. It neither complained nor compensated. It did not hurry. She increased the fire with caution. The stone stove accepted the additional wood without protest, the flames brightening briefly before settling into a steady burn. She waited for the familiar response inside, for the walls to gather warmth and return it with their usual patience. The response came, but it was slower, as though the house were asking a question rather than offering reassurance. Her son's cough returned that evening. It was not severe. It did not rattle or rasp. It was the kind of cough that would have gone unnoticed in a city apartment, drowned out by traffic and routine. Here, it filled the space, each sound amplified by concern. She listened from the low table as he worked on a page of arithmetic, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, he looked up at her, searching her face as he had learned to do in moments of uncertainty. "I'm fine," he said, anticipating the question. She nodded, but the words did not settle her. Fine was a fragile state here, dependent on temperature, on food, on calculations that allowed little margin for error. She tucked him into the sleeping niche, arranging the blankets with more care than usual, pressing her hand against the wall behind him to test its warmth. It was there, steady but no longer generous. That night she slept lightly, waking at intervals to check the air, the walls, the subtle signs she had learned to read. The house held, but it held differently. Each hour felt longer than the last, not because of discomfort, but because of vigilance. Doubt crept in quietly, insinuating itself into the spaces between observations. In the morning, she found herself moving through the routine with exaggerated precision. She measured wood by weight rather than habit, counted minutes at the stove, adjusted the order of tasks to minimize exposure to the cold. The discipline steadied her hands, but not her thoughts. She replayed every decision she had made since arriving, searching for missteps. Had she underestimated the severity of the winter? Had she misread the house's responses, mistaken consistency for resilience? Had her grandmother accounted for conditions like these, or had she simply been fortunate? The questions circled without resolution. The visit from the administration came sooner than she expected. 2 men and a woman this time, their coats heavy, their expressions professional. They spoke of regulations and inspections, of concerns raised by neighbors, of the presence of a child in a non-standard dwelling. They did not accuse. They suggested. The language was careful, designed to sound reasonable while implying inevitability. She answered as before, calmly, presenting documents, emphasizing the house's stability, its continuous use. She did not mention the recent cold, the slower response. She sensed that vulnerability would not invite understanding. It would invite intervention. When they left, the air inside the dome felt heavier, though nothing had changed. The pressure was no longer only environmental, it was social, legal, directed. Her son sensed it. He asked fewer questions that afternoon, staying close without demanding attention. When she stepped outside to tend the fire, he followed, standing at a careful distance, watching the flames with an intensity that mirrored her own. "Does it ever stop being cold?" he asked quietly. She considered the question. It was not about temperature, it was about endurance. "It changes," she said. "We change with it." That evening, the wind rose again. It found every weakness in the land, every exposed edge. Snow drifted higher against the dome, pressing into its curve, testing the boundary between inside and out. The house did not yield, but the air inside cooled further than before. She added wood. She waited. The warmth returned, but unevenly. She moved through the space, mapping the difference with her body. Near the walls, the air felt thin, quick to chill. Near the center, it remained denser, warmer, as if anchored to something beneath her feet. She knelt, pressing her palm against the floor, then her cheek. The sensation was unmistakable. The heat there was not surface warmth. It was stored, deep, and slow. Her son watched her from his niche, silent. When she looked up, their eyes met, and she saw in his expression the same mixture of curiosity and concern she felt herself. "The middle," he said again. "It stays warm." She nodded, unable to dismiss it now. The stone slab in the center of the floor had always been there, flush with the surrounding surface, its edges softened by years of wear. She had assumed it was structural, a reinforcement or anchor. Now it seemed to pulse faintly with warmth, responding differently than the rest of the floor. She did not touch it then. She was not ready. The cough worsened overnight, not dramatically, but enough to sharpen her fear. She adjusted his blankets, sat beside him longer than usual, monitoring his breathing. The house remained steady, but her trust in her understanding of it did not. By morning, exhaustion weighed on her. Doubt, once a background presence, had moved to the foreground, influencing every thought. She found herself imagining alternatives, escape routes, contingencies. Could she leave if she had to? Where would they go? How far would the authorities push? She stepped outside into the wind, letting it cut through her thoughts. The land offered no comfort, only clarity. This was not a place that tolerated indecision. When she returned inside, she paused at the center of the dome. The stone slab waited, indifferent to her hesitation. She knelt beside it, tracing its edge with her fingers. The stone was warm, warmer than it should have been, warmer than the walls, warmer than the air. Her grandmother's face surfaced in her memory, not as she had been in life, but as she had been in fragments. Hands steady despite age, eyes sharp despite silence, a way of moving that suggested intention rather than habit. She had not built randomly. She had not trusted to chance. Still, the act of opening something hidden felt like a violation. The house had offered shelter without demanding explanation. Interfering now carried risk. She stood, stepped back, and left the slab untouched. The storm that followed removed the choice. It came at dusk, the sky darkening abruptly, the wind shifting direction with a force that felt almost deliberate. Snow fell thick and fast, reducing visibility to a few steps. The distant houses disappeared entirely, swallowed by white. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that pressed against the dome from all sides. Inside, the temperature dropped steadily, not catastrophically, but enough to make inaction dangerous. She fed the fire carefully, conserving wood while maintaining heat. The response was sluggish. The walls absorbed warmth, but gave it back grudgingly, as if the outside cold were drawing it away as quickly as it arrived. Her son's breathing grew more labored. Panic surged, sharp and immediate. She forced it down, focusing instead on observation, on what the house was telling her. The center remained warm. The slab radiated heat that did not dissipate as quickly as the rest. There was no longer time for hesitation. She cleared the space around the slab, pushing aside the low table, rolling up the thin rug that had softened the floor. The stone revealed itself fully now, its surface worn smooth, its outline precise. She searched for seams, for leverage points, finding them only when she stopped looking for the obvious. With effort, she pried at the edge. The stone resisted, then shifted slightly, releasing a breath of warmer air from beneath. The sensation was immediate, undeniable. Heat rose, slow and steady, carrying with it a smell of earth and stone, not smoke. Her son sat up, eyes wide, watching. The slab moved inch by inch, heavy but not immovable. Beneath it, a cavity opened, lined with stone and clay, its surfaces darkened by years of absorbed warmth. The air that emerged was dense, alive with stored heat. She felt it on her face, on her hands, a deep warmth that did not flicker or fade. She understood then, with a clarity that cut through fear and doubt alike. This was not a feature, it was the core. The house was not merely insulated, it was layered, designed to gather heat from the external fire and hold it at its center, releasing it gradually, evenly, regardless of the conditions outside. The walls were only part of the system. The heart lay beneath her feet. She replaced the slab carefully, sealing the cavity once more. Almost immediately, the air inside began to change. The warmth spread outward, slow but decisive, stabilizing the space. Her son's breathing eased. The cough softened, then receded. She sat back on her heels, trembling not from cold, but from the weight of realization. The danger had not been the cold itself. It had been her incomplete understanding. The house had never failed. She had. As the storm raged outside, she stayed awake beside her son, no longer listening for signs of collapse, but for the steady, patient response of a system finally understood. Doubt did not vanish. It rarely did. But it no longer dominated. In its place was something heavier and more reliable. Responsibility, informed by knowledge. And with it, the quiet awareness that her grandmother had not built this house for comfort, or solitude, or defiance. She had built it to function when doubt became dangerous, when conditions stripped away assumptions and left only what worked. The house had waited for this moment. Now, so had she. The storm did not ease with the night. It deepened, settling into the land with a persistence that felt almost intentional, as if winter itself were testing the limits of everything it touched. Snow pressed higher against the curved walls of the dome, packing itself into every hollow the wind could find. Outside, the world narrowed to a few indistinct shapes swallowed by white. Sound became uniform, a continuous low roar punctuated by sharper bursts when gusts struck stone or wood. Inside, the change was unmistakable. The warmth that had returned after she replaced the stone slab did not surge or fluctuate. It spread slowly, like breath moving through a body that had been holding itself too tightly. The air grew denser, steadier. The cold no longer crept along the edges of the room with the same persistence. It remained present, reminding rather than threatening. She stayed close to her son, her senses sharpened by exhaustion and relief alike. His breathing evened out as the hours passed, the shallow tension easing from his chest. The cough retreated to something distant and infrequent, no longer commanding attention with each sound. She watched him sleep, measuring time by the rise and fall of his shoulders rather than by any external marker. The house worked. That realization settled slowly, heavy with consequence. It was not triumph she felt, nor gratitude, but a kind of sobering clarity. The system beneath her feet had not revealed itself out of kindness. It had responded to need, to pressure applied precisely where it was designed to bear it. The failure had never been structural. It had been interpretive. By dawn, the storm still raged, but the inside of the dome held its equilibrium. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb her son, and moved through the space with renewed attention. The warmth radiating from the center was subtle now, diffused evenly through the floor and walls. It no longer announced itself. It simply existed. She tended the external fire with measured restraint, feeding it only enough to maintain the cycle. The stone stove glowed dully beneath its cover, the heat it produced already accounted for, already stored. For the first time since arriving, she did not feel compelled to watch the flames constantly. The house had absorbed responsibility. Later that morning, shapes emerged through the snow. They were distant at first, barely distinguishable from the shifting white. But as they drew closer, she recognized movement that did not belong to weather. Figures appeared, hunched against the wind, their progress slow and uneven. She watched from the doorway, her breath catching not with fear, but with recognition. Neighbors. They came without ceremony, without knocking or calling out. They gathered near the external fire, hands extended toward the heat, faces drawn and pale. Some carried children wrapped in blankets too thin for the cold. Others moved with the stiffness of joints that had spent too long fighting temperatures their homes could not keep out. She did not invite them inside. The decision came without hesitation, guided not by selfishness, but by reality. The dome was not built for crowds. Its balance depended on scale, on the precise relationship between volume, mass, and stored heat. Opening it fully would disrupt that balance, risk everything it was designed to preserve. Instead, she directed them to the shelter of the fire. She adjusted the wood, increased the flame slightly, conscious of the calculations now running quietly in her mind. The heat radiated outward, creating a pocket of relative safety beneath the stone overhang and the ring of stacked logs that broke the wind. It was not comfort, but it was survival. There was murmuring among them, questions she did not immediately answer. Where was the stove inside? How was the house still warm? Why had the fire been placed outside at all? She responded minimally, conserving energy, both hers and theirs. Explanation could wait. Warmth could not. One child, younger than her son, shivered uncontrollably despite the blankets. His mother hovered nearby, eyes darting between the fire and the dome, hope and hesitation warring openly on her face. The wind cut sharply, and the boy's teeth chattered audibly. She hesitated only a moment. Inside, space was limited, but it was not non-existent. She assessed the conditions quickly, the state of the house, the warmth stored at its center. One additional body, small and still, could be accommodated temporarily without upsetting the system. More could not. She gestured to the woman and the child. They entered cautiously, removing snow-soaked boots at the threshold, their movements tentative as if expecting rebuke. The warmth inside surprised them immediately. The boy sagged with relief, his mother's shoulders dropping as tension released. They did not linger. She positioned them near the center of the dome, where the heat was most stable, and explained quietly that this was temporary. The woman nodded, understanding without argument. Survival bred cooperation faster than comfort ever had. Outside, the others remained by the fire, rotating positions to share warmth, tending to one another with the unspoken solidarity of necessity. There were no jokes now, no laughter at the shape of the house or the placement of the stove. The storm had stripped away those luxuries. As the hours passed, she became acutely aware of the house's limits. Each additional person inside altered the air, the balance of warmth and moisture. She monitored it constantly, adjusting ventilation subtly, opening and closing channels designed to manage breath as carefully as heat. The system responded, but it was clear that it was not meant to stretch beyond its design. By evening, the storm began to relent. The wind softened, the snowfall thinning until individual flakes could be seen again rather than experienced as force. The temperature outside remained brutal, but the pressure eased. The neighbors departed one by one, grateful but subdued. There were no declarations, no promises, only nods, brief words of thanks, eyes that no longer dismissed what they had witnessed. The woman and child left last. The boy had fallen asleep inside the dome, his breathing deep and even. When his mother carried him back into the cold, she paused at the doorway, meeting her gaze. "I didn't know," she said simply. She nodded. There was nothing else to say. That night, the dome returned to its intended occupancy. The house settled, its systems recalibrating with quiet efficiency. The warmth stabilized at its familiar level, the air drying gradually as the moisture from additional bodies dissipated. She felt the difference immediately, not as relief, but as confirmation. She slept briefly, waking before dawn with thoughts that refused to remain quiet. Her grandmother's presence pressed in on her memory, no longer as a vague figure, but as an engineer of circumstance. This house was not a response to isolation. It was a response to unpredictability, to systems that failed without warning, to winters that did not care whether one followed tradition or innovation. The hidden chamber beneath the stone slab lingered in her thoughts. She rose carefully, lifting the slab just enough to feel the heat rise again, steady and inexhaustible in its patience. The cavity was not mysterious now. It was legible, its purpose clear. Layers of stone and clay arranged to maximize thermal mass, to accept heat slowly and relinquish it even more slowly. Channels guided warmth outward, distributing it through the structure with deliberate inefficiency, ensuring nothing was wasted. She closed it again, her movements gentle, almost reverent. Later that day, she searched the storage niches more thoroughly, driven by a need she now recognized as understanding rather than survival. Behind jars and bundles, tucked into spaces only visible when one knew to look, she found papers wrapped in oilcloth. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the pages, precise and restrained. There were diagrams, calculations, notes on seasonal variations, on fuel consumption, on failure points. There were also letters. They were not addressed to anyone. They read more like arguments with the future, reasoned and unsentimental. She read them slowly, absorbing the intent behind the structure she now inhabited. The house was never meant to shelter many. It was meant to shelter responsibility. It was designed for one adult and a child, for continuity rather than expansion. The external fire was not eccentricity. It was separation, a deliberate choice to remove risk from the living space while maintaining efficiency. The storage ring of wood was not convenience. It was insulation, windbreak, and inventory combined. The hidden thermal core was the final layer, the acknowledgement that systems failed most dangerously when they appeared to work until they did not. It was insurance, not secrecy. Her grandmother had not been preparing for a singular catastrophe. She had been preparing for accumulation, for the slow erosion of reliability, for moments when doubt became dangerous. That night, as the temperature outside dropped once more, the house held without adjustment. The warmth flowed as designed, the balance restored. Her son slept soundly, his earlier illness now only a memory that sharpened her resolve rather than her fear. She sat at the low table, the papers spread before her, the dome illuminated by soft, indirect light. The house felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She no longer saw it as inheritance alone. It was instruction. The storm had passed, but winter had not. There would be more tests, more pressure, more moments where decisions mattered. She felt the weight of them settling into place, not as burden, but as responsibility accepted with eyes open. Outside, the land lay quiet beneath its blanket of snow. Inside, the heart of the structure continued its work, patient and unremarkable, proving what her grandmother had always known. Survival did not depend on tradition. It depended on precision. And now, she understood both. Spring did not arrive as a moment. It came as a series of small corrections, almost imperceptible at first, like the house itself adjusting to a new condition. The light through the narrow windows grew whiter, less strained. The snow retreated unevenly, revealing patches of hardened earth and grass, flattened by months of pressure. Water began to move again, first as a trickle beneath ice, then as a quiet presence that no longer felt trapped. Inside the dome, the change was felt before it was seen. The walls released their stored warmth more readily now, no longer guarding it with the same discipline winter had demanded. The air softened. The smell of earth replaced the sharper neutrality of cold stone. For the first time in months, she opened one of the ventilation channels fully and felt no immediate penalty for it. The house had endured. She walked its perimeter slowly one morning, examining the exterior with the careful eye of someone who had learned not to assume survival was accidental. The curved walls showed no cracks, no slumping, no signs of water intrusion. The straw within the structure remained dry, protected by the layers of earth and clay that had sealed it against moisture. Where snow had piled high, it had melted away without leaving rot or weakness behind. The external stone stove stood intact, its surface darkened by use, but structurally unchanged. Ash lay neatly where it should, evidence of fires that had burned steadily rather than violently. The ring of stacked firewood had done its work as well, breaking the wind, shedding snow, keeping the logs dry enough to light even at the worst of winter. She took inventory again, this time without fear. The food stores were low, but not dangerously so. The calculations had been accurate. There was no surplus, but no desperate scarcity either. What remained would carry them until the first fresh growth, until she could supplement their diet with what the land offered in warmer months. The honey jar was nearly empty, the last sack of dried beans lighter than before. But they had made it through without hunger, without illness, beyond the small scare that had forced her to understand the house more fully. Her son had changed. The winter had not hardened him, but it had focused him. He moved through the space with familiarity, no longer asking where things belonged. He had learned the rhythms of the house as naturally as children learned games. He noticed weather shifts before she did, commented on the way light moved across the floor, on how the warmth lingered longer on certain days. He did not speak often about the night of the storm, about the child who had slept inside their home, about the people who had gathered around the fire. When he did, it was without drama. Those events had not frightened him. They had taught him something more lasting. That safety was not guaranteed by numbers. It was guaranteed by preparation. The neighbors returned as the road softened and movement became easier. They came singly or in pairs, not as a crowd. The laughter was gone entirely now. In its place was a careful respect that did not demand explanation. They asked questions, but they asked them differently than before. Not with dismissal, but with attention. How had the house held its heat so evenly? Why had the stove been placed outside? How had she kept the wood dry all winter? She answered what she could, showed them the external systems, the way the storage ring worked with the wind rather than against it. She did not invite them inside unless necessary. The dome remained private, its scale unsuitable for demonstration. Some things, she sensed, had to be understood rather than copied. The local administration returned as well, this time with different language. There were still references to regulations, to standards, but the tone had shifted. They had seen the state of other homes after the winter, the damage, the cost of repairs, the strain on limited resources. Her house stood as a contradiction they could not easily dismiss. She presented her grandmother's papers calmly, the diagrams and calculations now familiar to her. She spoke not of ideology, not of innovation, but of function. Of a structure that had been inhabited continuously, safely, without external support. Of a system that did not burden infrastructure already stretched thin. They did not argue. They asked for copies. When they left, there was no threat of inspection. No suggestion that her son should not be there. The house had proven its legitimacy not through compliance, but through endurance. In the quieter days that followed, she read the remaining notes her grandmother had left behind. They were not sentimental. There were no expressions of regret or longing. The writing was practical, almost austere, concerned with variables and constraints. But threaded through it was a clear philosophy. The house was not meant to be admired. It was meant to be used. Her grandmother had written about scale, about the danger of building larger than necessary, about how every additional volume demanded energy, attention, and risk. She had written about how comfort was often mistaken for security, and how systems designed for convenience failed most dramatically under pressure. She had written about children, not about affection, but about responsibility, about building for those who could not choose their circumstances, who depended on decisions made before they were capable of understanding them. The house had been designed for that obligation, not for solitude. Reading those words, she felt a quiet shift inside herself. The inheritance had not changed her life by removing struggle. It had changed it by reframing it. She no longer measured her stability by income alone, by proximity to services, by the appearance of normalcy. She measured it by resilience, by the ability to respond when conditions deteriorated. Spring advanced. The land softened. She began planning not an escape, but a future. She marked places where she could grow food, where the soil, though poor, could be improved with patience. She considered small additions to the external systems, not expansions of the dome itself, but complementary structures that respected its scale. A covered workspace, a larger water catchment, improvements that did not compromise the balance her grandmother had established. Her son helped, asking questions that showed not fear, but curiosity. He had stopped asking when they would leave. One evening, as the sun set later than it had all winter, she sat outside near the stone stove, now cold and silent. The air was mild enough that she did not need to light a fire. The dome behind her held the last of the day's warmth, releasing it slowly into the cooling evening. She thought of the laughter that had once followed her arrival, of the dismissive looks, the certainty that she had made a mistake. She thought of how easily tradition had been mistaken for wisdom, and how fragile that assumption had proven when conditions changed. Her grandmother had not rejected the past. She had refined it. She had taken what worked and discarded what did not, regardless of how familiar it felt to others. She had built not in defiance of her neighbors, but in preparation for reality. The realization settled fully now, not as gratitude alone, but as responsibility passed forward. The house did not ask to be replicated. It did not promise comfort or ease. It offered something more difficult and more durable: the ability to endure without depending on illusions. As darkness fell, the land grew quiet. The winter was over, but its lessons remained, embedded not only in the structure of the dome, but in the way she now thought, planned, and chose. She was no longer a woman waiting for circumstances to improve. She was someone who understood how to live when they did not. And the house, modest and unremarkable to an untrained eye, stood beside her as proof that sometimes the most enduring inheritance was not property or wealth, but precision carried forward through generations. Spring would pass. Summer would bring its own challenges. Autumn would follow, inevitably. When it did, she would be ready. Not because she rejected tradition, but because she had learned how to decide. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the following videos to see more stories like this and explore the others already on the channel. And if you think this video is worth sharing, send it to someone who would understand it.